Well, joining me now is John Brennan, former CIA director under President Obama and a senior intelligence contributor here at NBC News. Mr. Brennan, welcome back.
Hi, Chuck.
Before I get to the issue of Kim and North Korea, you were actually referenced in the IG report, a specific email. The IG report contains an email that James Comey sent to you and Jim Clapper on October 5th explaining his silence on the Trump-Russia probe. In the email, he said this: I think the window is closed on the opportunity for an official statement. With 4 weeks until a presidential election, I think the marginal incremental disruption, inoculation impact of the statement would be hugely outweighed by the damage to the intelligence community's reputation for independence. How did you react to that?
Well, I think there were some really tough decisions at that time, and I certainly didn't envy Jim Comey, who had a number of interests that he had to balance in making sure that he pursued the investigation with vigor, while at the same time being as forthcoming as possible with the Congress and with the President. And any type of investigations that are underway, criminal investigations, make it very difficult. So I did not envy his position. There were some of those decisions I disagreed with, some of them I agreed with. But it was tough.
But he's sending this email to you guys. Whose decision was this? I mean, I
was going back and forth. There was a lot of discussions in the White House Situation Room about what exactly should be said, who should say it, and whether or not there needed to be this chorus of voices going out there. And so it was finally decided that Jim Clapper and Jay Johnson, the DNI, Director of National Intelligence and Secretary of Homeland Security, would put out this statement. And so there were questions with an ongoing investigation whether or not Jim Comey should be part of that or not. And Jim thought that it wasn't going to really, I think, help the case in terms of his name being there. The fact that the administration at a very senior level was going to put it out there, it would serve the purpose.
Were you involved in that infamous Gang of Eight meeting where reportedly Mitch McConnell was the one that threw cold water on trying to make a more bipartisan and more of a let's link arms, this is serious business statement?
No, I wasn't involved in that meeting. I had my own individual meetings with the Gang of Eight prior to that, where I spoke with Leader McConnell as well as others. And
were they questioning your findings at that time?
Senator McConnell did, yes.
Under what guise?
I think he thought that maybe the Democratic administration was trying to undermine a Republican candidate. And I took great umbrage at that, and I told him, and I said, Senator, I would not in any way politicize any type of intelligence. And so I want to make sure that you understand that this is the considered view and assessment and intelligence from CIA. And so I let it be known in no uncertain terms that I did find that comment of his a bit repugnant.
Did he ask questions? Did he want more information? Did he say, look, I'm skeptical, show me more? Was there any curiosity?
I'm not going to go into the details of the meeting other than to say that I think he was skeptical, and also I don't think he was all that pleased with my bringing that to him.
Was he? Did you get the sense he was uninterested in finding more information out from you?
Well, he didn't evince a strong interest in finding out what was going on. I think he was just reacting to what I was saying in terms of what implications it might have for the Republican candidate.
You compared the president to a demagogue in an op-ed earlier this month. And so I'm curious what you thought this morning of the president and the way he described Kim Jong-un, the way he's been talking about him, and what you believe the impact that has around the world.
Well, quite frankly, I'm sad to say that I don't find anything he says shocking or surprising anymore. I find them all outrageous. The fact that he has treated Kim Jong-un with such apparent deference, as well as speaking of him as being very honorable. Kim Jong-un is a despot. He is a murderous authoritarian leader who has
What are some of the things he has done?
He has summarily executed a number of individuals inside of North Korea because they may be political opponents.
So when the president says he's tough,
well, obviously he admires his toughness.
He's tough. Tough translates into, he murders his opponents?
Yeah, well, a lot of authoritarian leaders and despots and dictators have been tough. And apparently that's what Mr. Trump admires in other individuals.
What about the argument of the realpolitik, right? Where he actually says, hey, look, I'm going to deal with a dictator because I don't want a nuclear bomb to drop on your head.
Well, I think you have to deal with the issue and deal with the people. And so even at the point of maybe having a sit-down meeting, I think President Obama and other presidents before them said they would do the same thing. I think what he's doing right now, he's laying the groundwork for basic de facto acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear power. He's going to claim that Kim Jong-un has promised not to test. He is not going to continue to develop it. They're claiming that they're going to go down this denuclearization path. But I think by everything I've seen in the statement, there is no indication at all that he's going to push Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons.
Wasn't that where the Obama administration was likely headed to?
Well,
isn't this been where it's probably going to be Pakistan, that North Korea becomes Pakistan here?
Well, there was debate, certainly in the Obama administration as well as the Bush administration, about what can you do to prevent this from happening, and should there be some type of acceptance, but yet constrain it? And there was real differences of view on that. I think it has tremendous implications as far as other states pursuing nuclear weapons. If you basically say, North Korea is there, it has it, so we're not going to try to take them away. It's going to send a signal to others.
Before I let you go, Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, Kevin McCarthy, the likely next Republican leader in the House, Senator McConnell, the current Senate majority, both now saying it's time for the Mueller probe to end, to wrap it up. Based on your understanding of Bob Mueller, do you believe this probe would still be going on if he didn't have something?
I think Bob Mueller is not only one of the most respected public servants that this country has ever seen, he also is somebody who is exceptionally diligent, meticulous, and he is persistent. And I believe that Bob Mueller's special counsel team has a number of investigative threads that they've been pulling over the last year that are going to be bearing fruit. And I am counting on Director Mueller to once and for all address the issue about whether or not there was conspiracy, whether or not there was collusion with Russia. And despite what Mr. Trump said, that the DOJ IG report exonerated him, it did nothing along those lines. We have not seen anything yet from the special counsel indicating whether it be guilt or innocence that we're going to see of these people.
Have you seen evidence of a conspiracy between Americans possibly connected to the president and Russia?
Yeah, I think I famously said in a House hearing that I don't do evidence as an intelligence officer. Since I've been out of office, I have seen a lot of reporting that indicates to me that there was a lot of collaboration, a lot of interaction that, to me, requires people like Bob Mueller and others to look at whether or not it rose and reached the threshold of criminal activity. And there is a lot of smoke there and a lot of concern, at least on my part.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.